So this lecture is going to continue what we've talked about for arrangement, and I'm specifically going to be focusing on how to actually set up the outline. So just a few things to talk about. When we're moving from the informative speech, just like I've talked about the rhetorical canon as being sort of a stepping stone or stairway to the actual speech, we also want to think of each speech as being a stepping stone to the next one. So as we move to the persuasive speech, remember what we did in the informative speech carries on. So things like transitions, engaging the audience, sources, being factual and non-factual. All of that's going to carry on. We're not discarding that. So remember, we're building upon what we already know. I'm not going to be covering those things because we've learned them, we've developed them, but those will be required for the speech. So how do I create an outline? One thing that I've already mentioned, the introduction and the conclusion don't change. Just to review, remember the introduction still needs an attention getter. Now in Monroe's that's going to slightly change, and I'll come back to that, but if you are using statement of reasons or problem cause solution, you can use whatever you want for the attention getter. Thesis and preview, ethos, and value step. And then of course for the conclusion, you want to make sure that it's brief, so very quick, still same thing. We've added about a minute here for the time to the actual speech, but the conclusion should still be rather short. You want it to be clear, so let the audience know what they were supposed to be persuaded about. And you want to be memorable, so do something to end with impact. So that's really what you need to think about. As we move on into this lecture, it's the body of the speech that's actually going to change. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So requirements for the outline. There's a few things that we're adding in here. One is you're going to have more sources. This is 5 factual sources. Now I know 5 sources were required last time, but remember that was a combination of factual and non-factual. For this, you have to have 3 scholarly sources. So remember, these are things that you're pulling from the college's database, Google Books, right? Something that's scholarly, peer-reviewed. And then 2 reputable sources. Now just make sure reputable sources are websites and other sources that have credibility. If you have questions as to whether your source is reputable, you can always email me or talk to me after class. The other thing we're adding, 1 to 2 non-factual sources, so it's up to you. I would recommend probably 2, but I'm going to say 1 to 2 non-factual sources here is fine. A works cited page, that's still required. And rhetorical proofs, so we are adding that on as well. So you want to think about how to use the rhetorical proofs as well as which route you should be taking. If you have a controversial topic, use the central route. If you have a less controversial route, then the peripheral route. So some people might be asking, well, how do I actually use the rhetorical proofs? So logos, obviously this is where your evidence is coming in. Your scholarly and reputable sources, that will count as using logos. And then pathos, right? Ethos we already have required in the introduction. Pathos is going to be your emotional appeal, so using things like narratives, emotional images, testimony. So your factual sources really kind of count as your logos, and your non-factual sources count as your pathos. So that's how you're going to be using the rhetorical proofs in the speech. As far as how it's actually going to work, remember from the informative speech I kind of gave you a model. I said start with a factual source, then use a non-factual source, and then engage the audience. That format is still going to stay here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but those are things you still want to do, right? You don't want to overload the audience with a lot of factual information, but you also want to make sure at the same time you're not just using all non-factual sources, and you also want to make sure the audience is not passive, right? They're active in the actual speech. So, just a reminder, remember your persuasive question is going to correspond to the organizational format. So, if you are in question of fact, right, you have to use statement of reasons. Now, some people are like, well, what if I want to use Monroe's? You can't, right? Whatever question you are in is what dictates it. So personal action is Monroe's. Passive agreement is problem, cause, solution. Remember, the cause is optional here. So make sure you're clear on what your question is, and that will then dictate the format. All right, now I'm going to cover each of the formats. I'm going to start with problem, cause, solution. I know at this point some people might be like, okay, I'm just going to fast forward and get to the organizational format that I need for my speech. Don't do that. I will be asking questions about each of the organizational formats. You need to know these because a lot of them overlap, so understanding one will help your understanding of the other, and especially for problem, cause, solution, that's going to come up in the next speech, so you definitely want to know this. So I'm going to use an example of how this actually breaks down. So first, in the problem, you need to prove there is an issue, right? There has to be some sort of problem to solve. And then you can use evidence to actually make sure that this is something that you can prove is an issue that needs to be addressed. Then the cause, remember that's optional, but of course you can just basically talk about what's causing the issue. And then for the solution, remember there are two things you have to do. You must first tell us what the solution is. That might seem obvious, but for some speeches that have a more complicated solution, right, if they have multiple things they want to change, you need to clearly state that. Or if it's not clear on how the solution is actually going to be implemented, that's where you would clarify it. And then you also want to prove that it works. So let me use an example to show you how you would actually put this into an outline. I'm going to use the death penalty. So let's first start, obviously, with a problem. First, find a problem. So this is where your research is going to be part of this. What you want to start looking at is thinking about what would be a problem. Now you'll notice I'm in Google Books right here, so I found a book on the death penalty, so we're still researching the same way, still using similar sources, and I put in innocent. That's usually a kind of easy point if we're arguing against the death penalty. And right here it pinpointed a page that I can use. So talking about innocent people being executed. So this particular source, right, I could actually just use this. So evidence indicate that innocent people are sentenced to death, proof of their innocence often does not emerge until long after their convictions. So this kind of quote I could actually use. So if I go into my outline, right, that people who are innocent are killed and we don't know they are innocent until it is too late. So that would kind of be the point. I would then add that evidence. So I'm just right now going to put the source. I'm not actually going to write it, but know for the outline that you would need to do it. And then of course maybe you could use something like a non-factual. So this might be a good time to find a story. So if I actually go back up, there was a story right here that I can actually use about a man who was charged for murder and it was later found out that he was innocent. So this story right here I could take and probably put into my... So just as a shorthand, I'll just put story of innocent man. Remember, for the actual outline that you're turning into me, you do need to write all of this out. You can't just write the way I'm doing it. I just don't want to take the entire time to write it out for you in this example. And then of course if you want to come up with a way to engage the audience, right, I could maybe ask them a question. I could, say what do they think of the story. So it's really up to you. Once again, you want to write out what you're actually doing. I'm just using a shorthand here. So I found the problem, right, about innocent people being put to death. Another typical point is racial inequities. That's another argument that's very typical of the death penalty. Now, I'm going to skip over racial inequalities. It would be the same exact process. I would go through the research to find it. Now I can go to cause. So one thing that a lot of people talk about with the cause is sort of the unfairness of the justice system, that different people end up getting treated differently. So here's something I found that's a periodical, right, because this is from Time Magazine. This is in regards to evidence specifically for North Carolina, but this actually has evidence that relates generally as far as a racial bias. And one thing too that I feel a lot of people sometimes are not doing when they look at their sources is within a source you can actually find something. So right here, this is a report. This would lead me to a scholarly source. A study is in here, even a Supreme Court case. And that's one thing with the research process, going back to what I discussed with the informative speech, that to some degree you're a detective. You're not always going to know what you're going to find, but each of these would lead me to something. So if I click on that link, it will pull me up to this study right here, which actually is a really, really helpful piece of information. So I can go in and start using some of the statistics and pull that in. So just to go back to the outline, I talked about racial bias. I'm not putting anything here. Now what I would move on to is cause, right? And so that research, the study I just found, as well as the Time article, I would put in here. So I would start addressing what points they specifically say, which is, you know, that we do have a system that treats people based on their class and their race a lot differently. Alright, so once you've done that, you then can move on to the next step. Now, I'm going really quickly over this. Obviously, you would add a lot more points than what I'm saying, but I'm just kind of giving you a very brief overview. So for the solution, remember, 2 things you have to do. One is just say you would get rid of it. Now, the death penalty here is really easy. It's a clear solution. So what you would really want to focus on is proving that this would actually work, right? You need to look to examples of states or countries where this has been done and prove that it is effective. Alright, so just to also review as far as research for finding things about the solution, you can always go to the school's website to get into the database. I'm also going to remind you too about using Google. Google, like I said, can be good if you use Google Books or Google News, but right now I just typed in states without death penalty crime rate. So for instance, death penalty info, death penalty pro-con, those largely are going to be very biased sources, so you want to make sure that you're picking good sources. So this New York Times article actually may be pretty relevant to what I'm trying to persuade my audience of, and this would probably be one that I could pick, but the other ones that are biased you want to try and avoid. So to go back to my outline, I'm now going to do solution, just to show you what that would look like. So I'm literally just copying directly from what the Times article said. I'm going to put quotes around it because I want to source it. And this would be a really good piece of information. Now remember, this is proving that it works. The first thing is Florida will get rid of the death penalty. So then just proving that it would actually work is really what you would want to focus on here. Alright, so now moving on to Monroe's motivated sequence, I'm going to do a topic on exercise, which is one of the topics I didn't recommend. That's specifically why I'm choosing it. So to start with, we'll do the attention step. Now remember, unlike problem, cause, solution, the attention step actually is your attention getter. So I want to look for a narrative or find a narrative to demonstrate the. I really like the idea of using a real narrative, so I chose this. This is something I found online when searching issues of health and weight loss. So to go to the actual outline, remember the introduction is actually where you're going to start the first step, the attention step. I'm just putting the picture here so I don't have to write out the entire story, but I would basically give a synopsis about Kathy, probably put her image up, you know, and say that she always had issues with her weight and she had had a baby and she hadn't lost the baby weight and she was just getting really unhealthy and not able to keep up with her son and wanted to do something better. So then I would move on to my first body point, which is going to be the need. Now remember, this is parallel to the problem and problem, cause, solution. So what I need to do is, in fact, prove that there is a problem. So one thing to prove is that people aren't exercising, or sort of a sedentary lifestyle, right, is what you would want to talk about. So when I researched this, I found a source that worked out well. right here from WebMD. So this would count as a reputable source, not a scholarly source, but obviously it has some credibility. So this would give me an idea of why it's a bad thing and the fact that a lot of people are doing it. So some of this information is helpful, and also you'll notice too it's giving information on how to fix this. So this could also be something that I could come back to when I want to go to my action. So I've added my WebMD source, another probably non-factual source, maybe some other stats just to prove that it's a problem. Obviously, once again, all of this is shorthand. I'm not writing it out fully, but this is what you would want to do in the need. The same kind of thing that I did in the problem step. So now that we've got the audience's attention, we've proved there's a problem, we then move on to the satisfaction step, which is telling the audience what they should do and the benefits of it. So it's similar to the solution of the problem called solution step, but instead we're focusing on the So the obvious thing is exercise, right? Don't be sedentary. Here I would use a source to prove the benefits. So obviously things like your health and you'll feel better and all sorts of things. That's what you would want to put in the satisfaction step of your outline. The last two steps are visualization and the action step. Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is that you can actually flip these steps if you want to. So in the speech that you had to watch for homework that was on convincing the audience to volunteer for the Special Olympics, she switched them, right? She started with the action step. So she gave the audience information and then she ended with the visualization or conclusion. That's also an option. You can do that. So the last two steps, if you want to, you can switch them. Now remember, visualization is fixing the narrative and action is giving the audience information to complete the step. So I'm going to start with visualization. So I'm going to go back to Kathy's story and visualization, and this was a before and after. That's how I found this picture. So now obviously I'm showing her after, right? She made this big breakthrough, and she started working really hard. She got on a system for meals, started exercising, and lost the weight. Now for the action step, remember I'm going to give the audience specific information to fix the problem. So for the last step, it's going to be the conclusion, and this is where action is going to be. So what I would list are probably things that are specific to my audience. So maybe talk about access to the school gym, right? Or ways between classes you can work out, right? Little things like that. So giving them specific information, you would also want to say the location, time, things like that. So you're really just giving the audience information here so that they can complete the step, that they will have everything that they need. Alright, and the last organizational format is statement of reasons. Now this one, like I mentioned, is very similar to the informative speech. Most of my students don't fall into the category of using statement of reasons, so I don't spend as much time on this. But basically what you need to know is it's a breakdown of your points, right? You're going to be choosing a topical order for how you actually want to do them. So this is an example outline that I've shown before for statement of reasons. This particular topic was about 9/11 being an inside job. So remember, the introduction is still the same, all of the same elements that we've talked about before there. What's going to change in the body is that you are doing a similar format to the persuasive speech. So first he starts talking about structural information in regards to steel, the issues of impact, and then controlled demolition. So he's really just breaking it down just like we did for the other speeches. You'll notice he's putting in his evidence, right, his quotes, things like that, and developing the speech. So that's really what you want to do. This particular speech right here ends at about it's really like 3.5 pages. That's a pretty good rule of thumb for your outlines when you're writing out this much, because typically it takes about 1.5 minutes per page, depending on, how you're engaging the audience or what specifically you have planned. So that's a good way to do it. And then, of course, ending with your works cited page. I don't have that on this example, but he is citing the sources, so he definitely has a lot of good stuff in here. Remember, if you want to find other examples, this is my faculty page. The one for personal action and passive agreement, I used that in the last video, and we also went over this in class, but just in case you want to go back to it, by all means, you can use those as examples just to make sure you're clear on the organizational form. So that is it for the lecture. As far as homework, there are two things that you need to do. First, you need to answer a few questions just so I can make sure you understand everything. So what did I use for the visualization step in Monroe's? Name one source I used for the problem of problem cause solution. Name one of the points for the statement of reasons speech, so anything that was listed as a point. What can be switched in an outline? I talked about this for one particular format, so just tell me what can be switched, not what can be left out, not optional. That's not what I'm asking. What did I discuss in the solution of problem cause solution? The other thing, and this is the really important thing that you need to do, is the rough draft of your outline.